So our format today is that we're going to hear from three speakers. They're going to give a short presentation that kind of gives us some context to their work and their experience. We'll have a shared discussion, a bit of a shared discussion, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So please do use as we're going along, please do use the chat function to raise questions, and we'll hopefully have time at the end to pick those up and pose them to the speakers. So I'm going to introduce the three speakers, and then I'll pass to the first, and we'll just pass along till we've heard from all of them. Our first speaker today is Érika Melek Delgado. Érika is a lecturer in the history of empire in the Department of History at King's College London. Her research and publications focus on African history, diaspora, imperial history, and digital humanities. And she's the principal investigator of the Historical African Childhoods Project, co-director of the Freedom Narratives Project, and project coordinator of King's Pass, all of which are digital humanities projects, and some of which I think we'll be hearing about today. Our second speaker today is JC Niala. JC is the head of research, teaching and collections at the History of Science Museum. And JC previously led on the Rethinking Relationships project with the Horniman Museum, Pitt Rivers Museum, Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, and World Museum Liverpool. It became the largest digitally delivered provenance research on African ethnography and included collections and participants from 3 countries in Africa and in Europe. Her work redefines archival engagement using absence as a tool, and she works to merge collaborative public history with digital innovation to uncover plural histories. And our final speaker today is Anne Samson. Anne is a South African-born independent historian specialising in the First World War in Africa, and runs the Great War in Africa Association, an online network and research hub for all interested in researching the First World War in Africa, and a small publishing house. As a result of her research in African, British and European archives, she advocates for greater and affordable access to seldom used collections and research. So many thanks, and we'll pass to Érika.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Liz, for inviting me to speak today. So today I have a lot of stuff to talk, but I think maybe we'll let this for the discussion. And we're going to use my 5 minutes around just to explain one of the projects that I work and I co-direct with Professor Paul Lovejoy. So I'm going to share my screen. So I hope you all can see. So today I'm going to talk about freedom narratives and explain why we think it'd be interesting to bring these projects for the discussion today. So freedom narratives is a digital humanities and his public history project that aims to talk, to connect on the biographies, testimonies, and voices of individuals that was born in Africa. So freedom narratives, it's a project that was thought, it started to be thought by Professor Paul Lovejoy in around like 10 years ago. And when I started a postdoc with him in the end of 2017, we really thought about that at the time we need to think about the methodology to put this project in real life. Until that time, like the discussions around digital humanities and especially around African history in connections to slavery has been changing. And for many years, this discussion around slavery has been focusing on if you could know how many people had been suffering this horrible situation around the 400 period. And when in the 90s, when Slave Voyage, that is another public digital humanities project, was launched, we could start to think about numbers. However, like as Liz said, like when SCOLMA started, like in 10 years, a lot of has changed. And the idea was like we couldn't anymore be talking about the life of these people just through numbers. So Paul and I thought in a way that how we could like combine the like a digital humanities project that we could still like being able to track the amount of people we are talking about, and the same way with the respect and historical figure that we would present these people's life. So that was how Freedom Narrative came. So Freedom Narratives is a database that aims to collect personal information. I always say that we're talking about life narratives. We're not really talking about strictly same biographies, because these are life narratives where a historian is behind the collection of this data, and a historian is constructing the life information of this person. So for these, a lot of change should be done as well on the method that the historian will be dealing with the source. So what kind of questions we could get. A lot until now, but I think thankfully that perspective has been changed. We are agreeing that we can get more information than we thought we could get. So, but because for me, a moment we would say that if we don't have like a full self-written like autobiography of someone, we could not assess this person information. But we thought that like it would be better to get the information we have, and that with scrutiny assess that information, put that in a very well thought database where that information can be checked, can be claimed by different people, that can be worked. So we can construing with all the contributors like the biography or the life narrative of this person. So we mostly organized this database by the name of this person is known, and all the personal information. And from that, the heart of the project is the events that this person lived, and we went to the events detail. And after we try to track where these events happened, the location, where it, of course, when and where, so the idea is we can, for each person is being entered in the database, reminding that when we talk about transatlantic slave trade, we're talking about more than 12 million people. So we aim with this project to be entered as much people as we can. And when we track them into place and time, we can also be able to draw in connections of people that we never thought they would have ever experienced. And I think on that way as well, we start to think about experience of like personal life experience that for many years has been ignored about the life of these 12 million people. So friendship, kinship, any other kind of relationship that someone was experiencing at the same time. So one thing I think it's very interesting about Freedom Narratives is like, I have been, and I'm going to be talking about a lot of this later, but I have been involved with Sierra Leone Public Archive for more than 10 years. And that involvement started through the British Library in Danger Archive, but the relationship got beyond. And when we were doing the digitalization for this project, we could have the access as well of the digital information of the source that has been held in the British Library. But with the agreement of both institutions, the Sierra Leone and the British one, we are able to display a lot of those informations as well in the website. And the idea to do that, it's because we wanted to, that of course comes from a set of data that are going to be already displayed in the British Library. But the idea is like we are being able to provide information that a lot of people around the world would not be able to access. And when we say that, it's not just like information from Africa being able to access by Europeans, but like information from archives in Africa being able to access for all the global South countries in an exchange, you know, like, because you're talking about a trade that was happening in many parts of the Atlantic. So data is everywhere. So when we are able to, when we had agreement, we are able to show the document will be presented. And we are not an archive, but we try to deal with this with the most rigorous way. But I want to be clear, we are not an archive. And also each event, we have the document that the event is talking about, so people can check this later. Yeah, so that we also have our public history site where we try to address like little clinch of those histories in our social media. So we have a campaign called FN Bios, where we enter like a little biography of a person that you have like much more complete data in the database, with an idea that to show the life of these people to a wider public. And when we also create the website, we also created thinking about the users and try to make this not just an academic environment. So we tend to attract people attention, and I could say at least for diasporic people in Latin America, that has been very engaging, you know, and I feel that's something I wanted to focus more in the near future. And just to finish, like the project at the moment, it's on hold. So if you can look at our website, but it is on hold because we needed to make a big structure, like digital structure and content structure. And I think it will launch again in 6 months. So it is. Thank you so much.
So I think we're passing over to JC. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure if they're...
Hello, I hope you can all hear me all right. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being here. I am JC Niala from the History of Science Museum, and the first challenge that we have somewhere like the History of Science Museum is actually agreeing on what is African. So if we could have the next slide, please. Many of our African collections, and people are often surprised to hear that they're African collections at the History of Science Museum, are from North Africa. The countries like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. And as we know, especially when it comes to Egypt, the only time we tend to agree when Egypt is in Africa is during the World Cup. But this is actually quite a serious question because in Morocco and in Algeria and other North African countries, as well as the more familiar Arabic African people, there are also Black African people in those countries. And there's been quite a revival recently, some of you may have seen it on social media, for the recognition that North Africa really is a part of Africa, with, to come back to the World Cup briefly, the Moroccan coach actually saying, you are African during the World Cup. And so this is a really powerful question when you're dealing with instruments like the one in front of you, which is an astrolabe, which was made in Morocco, which is a scientific instrument, and can be seen all across North Africa, going into countries like Spain with the Moors, going into all the way up to Persia. And there's quite an interesting categorization that tends to happen with African scientific instruments, and that they tend to be labeled Islamic, with a kind of, not a complete erasure, but with a subsuming of their African identity or origins underneath the religious one. And these are some of the questions that we're wrestling with, particularly because more broadly, the categorization of Islamic art or Islamic science is being questioned, because we don't say Christian art or Christian science quite in the same way. So why does this matter when it comes to digital work and dealing with community colleagues and community members? Because it's actually a question of trust, which is really important. Recent studies and surveys that have been done show that curators are considered some of the most trusted professions in the UK, which is wonderful on the one hand when we're thinking about it, you know, from Europe or the diaspora, but from the African continent, there's a very different view. If you consider this object to be part of your heritage and part of your scientific knowledge, and when it's that part of where it's from is removed from the record. So if I can have the next slide, please, I'd like to move on to this question of trust a little bit further. And we also have at the History of Science Museum what would be considered more quote unquote traditional African collections, and particularly given that we're at a SCOLMA meeting, so these are 2D collections. What you have in front of you is a photograph that was labeled of King Wambugo and his 16 wives from Kikuyu communities. It was taken in East Africa just before the First World War, and it raises up lots of questions about hidden collections. And when you have community colleagues, people in the diaspora, those who want to work on African collections and they're accessing archives, these are the kind of photographs that don't always emerge, and people don't even know they're there. If we take it a step further and we look at some of the language that is used, a lot of the language, we hear and we experience a language that we consider very outdated now, native groups. The people in the photographs are treated as objects, which when you consider the history of science, particularly on the African continent, is highly problematic. I'll give you a live example. The Eugenics Society in Kenya didn't stop the work that it was carrying out until almost the 1960s. So if you see a photograph where people are being referred to as objects, and you know it has come from a colonial context in which eugenics had already been discredited in Europe, but was still being practiced on the continent, it raises a lot of questions about what this photograph was about, and particularly why it ended up in a History of Science museum. So these are some of the challenges, but if we can move to the next slide, of course, there's always the solutions and responses. And particularly in the digital space, if there's one take-home message that I would like to share with you from my 5 minutes, it's that actually the most exciting and the most dynamic and the most relevant responses are coming from the continent at the moment. I will mention just a few examples. Some of you may be familiar with the Museum of British Colonialism, but there's also the African Digital Heritage Project. There's the Women's History Museum of Zambia project. And one of the things that's common to a lot of these African responses and these Africa-based, Africa-led archives and digital projects is that they often respond by using appropriate technologies. On the African continent, mobile phones are the main way in which people access the internet. They also challenge colonial legacies of categorization, and they really humanize online engagement that we here could learn a lot from. And one of the other things that I've noticed about them is a lot of them tend to be women-led, which I think speaks to a great history on the continent of women being seen as the holders of culture and heritage, and the ones who navigate that inheritance, which is something in very traditional colonial archives, women are often absent, whereas it's actually the complete reverse when we think about African history and the African responses today. So moving on to the final slide, I'll just talk very, very briefly about a project that I was involved with, which in many ways actually really helped to shape my thinking about this, which was rethinking relationships and building trust around African collections. There's a photograph there from the first phase. And we worked, as was mentioned in the bio, both on the continent and in Europe as well, with community members, carrying out provenance research, connecting the collections to their people and transforming museum practice. I'm very excited to say that there's now phase 2, and it's going to be live from the 1st of May, being run by Dr. Nicola Stagliano. Please forgive my typo, I've just noticed in the slide. And we'll be sharing with you the project phone number. She'll be based at the Pitt Rivers Museum. The project has now gone on to include Ghana and Tanzania, alongside Kenya and Nigeria. And I would encourage you all to get involved with it or to find out more about it, because it is doing some fantastic work in the digital space. So I'll stop now and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, JC. And over to Anne.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much, Liz and Helen and SCOLMA, for organising today. I'm going to be talking about the Great War in Africa Association. Let me go on to the slides. The Great War in Africa Association is an online hub of information for anybody interested in researching the First World War in Africa. The focus is predominantly on the British areas that were involved in the war, although we do include Britain's allies of Belgium and Portugal, as well as the German territories and people who were involved. We haven't tended to focus on French West Africa, language being one of the big issues, and also just time constraints. And as JC was talking about North Africa, it's a very contentious area. A lot of what was happening in the First World War in North Africa was from Europe, but we're also very conscious that there were people from North Africa involved in the war, particularly in Egypt. And it's about capturing their information more so rather than those coming in from Europe. Shipping logs will give you a very good idea as to how much was moving through the area as opposed from Europe as opposed to within Africa itself. The Great War Africa Association came into being in 2011, initially as the Great War East Africa Association, and then evolved into the Great War Africa Association, as we realized that pretty much all roads lead to East Africa. So we had troops coming in from West Africa, South Africa, North Africa, Europe, etc. We try not to duplicate what is on other sites, because that's where you go. There is a bit of overlap with the First World War Studies group, particularly around our bibliography or list of books. However, we differ from them in that we will include biographies and less academic texts as well. But we try not to duplicate what's on other sites. What we will do is revamp or rework what information is there to assist researchers going to find the information. The challenge with this, as we found over the centenary years of 2014 to 18, is that a lot of those websites have now become defunct. And a number of people asked me, as 2018 was coming to an end, is the Great War Africa Association continuing, or is it going to disappear? We're here to stay for as long as possible. And one of the things that inspires me to keep the Great War Association going is that there are so few people researching the topic, few youngsters coming through, young historians coming through with an interest in the area. A lot of the veteran groups are sadly dying out, looking for places for information to go. And so I'm seeing the Great War Africa Association as being a repository for the future, a way to safeguard information for future generations when they want to come back and look for information that will no longer be around. And on that front, I should say a big thank you to the British Library, because they do a backup of our site at least once a year, as far as I know. They ask permission for that. I think it's reduced to about once a year now, in order to keep the rich resource that we've got going. So that gives me hope for the future as well. I should also point out that this is all a labor of love. It's all voluntary. And as a result of that and discussions I've had with people around Africa, different archives, online, in person, Europe, here in Britain as well, we're starting by default to become a repository because archives in Africa are struggling so much. Access is difficult. We're starting to gather some of that information and resource, and that itself is causing a problem. So we've had to think quite innovatively of how we do things. If I move on to the next slide. So one of the things we've done is to start publishing texts, original source material, which other archives wouldn't take the original. So we've ended up, Chawaya War Echoes and War Voices are original interviews with African veterans. We've captured diaries in different formats, and we're now also putting stuff online in a way that can be accessed by people in Africa on their mobile phones, etc., because the cost of academic books or any books getting into Africa is really, really exorbitant, and puts a big barrier in. So I think we're going to be discussing a lot of what the challenges are in our next bit, so I'm not going to go into them in great detail. But one of the issues that we have in terms of the Great War Africa Association and how we work with things is what to include. How do we deal with copyright issues? How do we engage people to provide information, to share information, that it's not all one way? How do we ensure integrity of material, particularly if we're changing the format, because we can't put a photograph of an original document on screen because of copyright issues, etc. And one of the ideas that I've been speaking to people about is having a crowdsourced archive, which is effectively what the Great War Africa Association is becoming, but it shouldn't be that, because we need to have a more coherent approach to archives. We're coming at it from the ground up, and there are a whole lot of other issues, as I've raised there, the politics of who leads, who funds, who curates, and how do we deal with electricity going down. You know, British Libraries, sadly, has been hacked recently. The South African National Archives website has crashed recently because the database is so old, and various other issues that we have to deal with. So I'm going to leave it there, but that gives you a flavour of what we do. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, all our speakers. So I'm going to take the chair's prerogative of raising some questions, which I think draw or speak to some of the themes that you've already mentioned. So we heard about work in very different contexts with different kinds of material and different kinds of communities, but there's some common themes already emerging there about the need to return humanity and a sense of relationality to historical figures. The importance of surfacing historical resources, the potentially uneasy relationship of those resources to Western knowledge, traditions and practices, and the importance of thinking about who's centred and who's leading these initiatives and the use of appropriate technologies. We heard a little about challenging difficulties presented by language and geography, and some of the other challenges, including the obsolescence of some digital platforms and some of the barriers. I think we just heard, especially from Anne, about some of the barriers around copyright funding that are emerging in this across this work. So I'm going to ask a question which speaks to things that you've already mentioned, but just to draw it out a little bit more, which is about how the digital presentation of African archives can resist reproducing the colonial ideologies embedded in so many of these resources collections and how they've been documented and catalogued. So how can these digital platforms resist reproducing colonial ideologies and create new opportunities for equitable collaboration? Érika, should we start with you?
Thank you. Yes, that is definitely not that I, sorry, can you hear me? Okay, because they were saying I was muted. Well, I feel like that is, I feel that's the main core of the questions that I think anyone trying to work with archives, not even just in the continent, but in other parts of the world that is not the global north, it is how can we deal with a number of sources that has been most of the time produced by a group of people with way perspective of the group of people they were creating the documents about, and organize those documents and collections in the way that makes sense to them. And I can tell like a little bit more how I see that, like thinking like a project when I try to find information about people, and dealing with the lack of funding and interest to those kinds of documents. For instance, for freedom narratives, and I think that has been the main goal why the project was created, that we felt like despite the number of documents has been created, has a aim, like people were creating documents to completely take, not to praise the person they were writing about it. I think we still could deal with the document through a different way, that we can find like the information that we needed. Of course, always take into consideration who is writing, what they're concerned, why they're writing this, and so on. And I think on that, the archive and the organization of the document itself goes with the same problem. I feel like as a historian, I would never let the document go, but I do feel like when you give the space to new people looking at the documentation, people that has a different perspective. And most of the time, as JC said, like giving the leading for the groups of that understand what are the sources about, to understand what they, because it's, I can tell I am a Brazilian that have studied West Africa and not Portuguese speaking countries in the continent. And I realized that like a lot of my troubles for understanding a lot of stuff that I didn't understand stop when I start to communicate to people that were from that area, and stop to try to my own relationship with just like Europeans or people from the US, because the information is there. So my main work with people from Sierra Leone Public Archives, for instance, is when like we realized that like not just photographing the documents and let them and preserving a digital version of it in the British Library, that it's an amazing project. We need as well find a resource for the physical archive, and also find a resource for their digital archive. And the collaboration has changed completely how even I see the documents that are there. So I feel like literally find ways to give in that people leadership for the change, and really thinking documents in different organizations, because they can be done.
Thank you, Érika. JC, did you want to speak to that those issues about addressing colonial ideologies embedded in the archive and opportunities for equitable collaboration?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a couple of things I can say. First of all, when I was leading on rethinking relationships, the best engagement and conversations that happened around that project, and remember there were close to 100 people involved by the time the project was at its height, I was not party to. I wasn't involved with. The organizations and the institutions that I was working for facilitated that by providing infrastructure around mobile technology so people could get mobile internet on the continent. We provided platforms, but actually, I think that there's sometimes that sense of radical decentering of the archive, and institutions providing resource, but knowing that they may not be party to what is going on and the conversations that are happening and the work is happening, I think is really important. Because as long as things have to get processed by the systems that were set up in these institutions, it's very, to quote the well often quoted Audre Lorde with, the master's tools and the master's house. So I think that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is institutions being willing to change those systems. So when inviting community colleagues in, being able to say, okay, if this data, if you can break the database, and then we find a new way to rebuild it, let's actually do this. And for all the reasons we understand, institutions have a bit of a hesitancy around that, but it is beginning to change. And I think it's about working with community colleagues and also not just communities, but also there's lots of our colleagues in similar analogous institutions on the continent who will only be too happy to work on these issues as well. And so it is sometimes really about having to say, okay, if we have an object, for example, or a book, recognizing that even the colonial borders that would define it as belonging to this country or another need to be challenged on a level. And we're seeing that happening. So I've seen funders like DCMS actually funding a project that's saying it was started off saying it was working in Kenya, but recognizing that it was working with Maasai peoples and therefore ended up being in Tanzania as well. Now, in the bad old days, there would have been issues around the reporting, why are you in the wrong country? But thankfully, because things are beginning to change, they were able to understand, yes, this was a colonial border, and therefore, if you're working with a particular community, they can come from more than one country.
Thank you. That's so interesting. And thinking, if we think transnationally, to what extent our databases and systems are able, as you say, to facilitate that. And did you want to come back on that question?
Yeah, thank you very much. For me, the issue is going to Africa to find out what Africa actually feels and wants in terms of digital archiving. We've been talking a lot about physical documents, but one of the things that a recent visit back to South Africa really struck home with is that oral history and the oral record in Africa is part and parcel. It's the equivalent of what we have here in Britain as the written document. And no archive actually is, as far as I know, is recording these oral histories. When we know people have tried to put oral histories into archives, they've been rejected, whether it's been in America or here in Britain. Talking to young people in South Africa, there's been a whole issue around silences. And I think these silences happen elsewhere in Africa as well, because of the more violent struggle that people had towards independence. People are really scared about talking of the past. And it's about finding safe ways to get these histories recorded and to be dealt with in a way that is pertinent to Africa. Not being told by us in Europe, Britain, America, how they should be thought about, how they should be recorded, etc. And I think that comes to an issue of remits as well. And I think, JC, you've touched on this a bit in terms of funding. What is the remit that an organization is following? We've got thankfully, some organizations have found very creative ways to enable access to material that otherwise would have just gone onto the rubbish dump. I've had big discussions with archives in South Africa about where things go. We've had similar issues in other countries as well, because it doesn't fit the current narrative. And then the border issue is so important. And this comes home really strongly with World War I in Africa, where we've got, borders didn't exist in those days as we know them today. And in order to do one person's history at a genealogical level, you need to access 4 or 5 different countries' archives. And that proves a really difficult thing to do. What gives me hope, though, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but part of the International Council of Archives, there is a local branch in Africa called ISABICA, which is Eastern Southern Africa regional branch. They're operating at a regional level in terms of archive discussions. However, on the ground, each country has its own policies for archive access. Which makes it really difficult for people who are not in the academic world, and I think even in the academic world, to access those archives. Making them digital, there's a whole another issue around that in terms of who's got funding, who hasn't got funding. Those are internal political issues that I've been exploring with people. South Africa, we've had discussions in Kenya, Tanzania as well. So there's a huge amount in terms of getting the digital archive going. And I think it's a two-way thing. It's not just coming from Britain, America, Europe. It's also Africa and the different countries being prepared to share what's in their archive. And we need to encourage that in order to get 360-degree history written and to stop the biases. I'll leave it there. I can go on forever on this topic.
That's great, Anne, and I think you start to point us towards our next question and the future of online engagement with African archives. I realise we've got 15 minutes left. I want to ask a sort of final question of our speakers, but also open the floor to other participants today who would like to raise questions. So please, I'm going to ask my question there, but please do use the chat function or raise your hand if you've got a question for our speakers. So the last question I would like to ask, building on Anne's kind of provocation there, is what the future of online engagement with African archives might look like, and also what's needed to realise this future. Érika, JC, perhaps one of you would like to speak to that? Érika, thank you.
I just very briefly, because I love Anne's provocation. I think you're right, and I think we needed to find a way to to let those archives in the continent as well, being able to like happy to share. However, I feel like that it goes to the question, there is a feeling of stealing. I feel my main feeling with, like, when we're working for archives, and again, not just there, but in other parts of the world, like they feel like that it's a kind of a piece of history that in some way just hold it here, and a lot has been always giving. So a lot, my main point, and I think that is, for me, is the big challenge, is how we come with projects of digitizing and making this available for the world, but in the same way we return this to those places that has been, like a lot of their infrastructure is going apart, but that data is saved online, and in some way they feel like we don't have any importance anymore when we digitize, and we can go away because now there is a saved copy, I don't know where in the world. So I think that's the biggest challenge. It's find a very equal way of working with both sides. And one thing I just want to point that I think it's very important that JC mentioned, a lot of those resources we are producing cannot be open or unaccessed on those countries, so we need to find technologies that would be working, they look less fancy, maybe in the internet in London, but it would look possible to the world. So thinking less in aesthetics and more in the actual necessity. And I have a big claim on someone has been working with digital humanities for quite a long time. Even the fundings for the UK and North America side, they kind of want a new thing every time. So for instance, for my own project, after 5 years of funding, the reason why we also stopped because the funding ended, and to apply for new funding, they want a new project. But I'm already has a massive project to go on. I have relations, so I don't want to create a new project. That project's good enough. So it's how we have managed to have funding for the physical structure and also for the relationships. I think that's a big deal in itself.
Thank you. I'm sure others will share your frustration about the difficulty of sustaining grant-funded projects. JC, your thoughts on how the future of online engagement with African archives?
I'm very hopeful. I think that we've got lots of opportunities, and I think that, as I said earlier, they come from the continent. So talking of the continent, I don't know how many of you read the Continent Weekly newspaper that gets delivered on WhatsApp, and you can download it. To me, that's a really wonderful model that could be used for archives. So if things get delivered on WhatsApp, I mean, it's beautifully produced, absolutely wonderful, works on a platform which is accessible to people. So why couldn't we have archival documents that were distributed in that way? I think because of the challenges on the continent, it's really important to also have distributed archives. We know how vulnerable certain states are. So if we work with communities that naturally have been working across borders for millennia, why don't we also use that? I'll also share briefly about a wonderful project in Kenya that was a part of National Museums Kenya, but in Kitale, the Kitale branch, which is in Western Kenya. And what the museum found is that elders were coming to the museum really concerned that they were libraries. They had all this knowledge that they wanted to pass on to younger generations. Some of it genealogical, some of it, literally walking archives. And the younger generation, where they were approached, they said their main concern was getting jobs. So the museum decided to come up with this incredible project where they started a tree planting. They raised the funds. And this is the thing about funding as well. Sometimes raising funding for something else can allow you to do the same work. So they raised the funds for an environmental project where elders were going to teach younger ones about tree planting. And in the morning, they would do the tree planting. And in the afternoon, they started to teach young people about the history of the area, what was important to them, all these genealogies. And the museum found that actually the young people were remembering this. When they would check in with them, suddenly you had a young man who knew nothing about the cultures and customs historically and was able to recite all sorts of things. You found, young women who had worked with some of the elders in particular crafts. That area is very well known for making very specific pots. These were also being passed on. So I think, for me, it's about looking at these incredibly well thought through, well evidenced African technologies and then marrying them with digital innovation And that will allow things to transform. So I feel very hopeful.
Thanks, JC. And Anne, I don't know if you wanted to say more on that question, and then I'll move to the chat. So please, people, do put questions in the chat and we'll come to those. But Anne, did you want to say anything more about the kind of future of online engagement?
Thank you. I think it is positive, or it does look hopeful, particularly if we engage in creative ways of doing things, as JC's explained with that one project. And I've seen that with other projects as well, that are kind of being grown in country, in continent from Africa, where people are allowed to take ownership and move things forward in a way that works for that part of Africa. And it's sort of supplemented by monies from outside or expertise from outside. And I think it's about just keeping an honest, open relationship and partnership with whoever we're working with, and to keep the dialogue going and to just find opportunities. That for me, and not to forget that there is an incredible expertise in Africa that can be garnered and then brought to the front. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Anne. There's some questions coming through in the chat.